Good morning. My name is Alana Kubeczka, and I will let Maria introduce herself as well in just a second. So I am an instructional designer here at Lone Star College and also an adjunct professor at University Park. I also come with 25 years of teaching experience before this in K-12, and that is really where I found my passion for working with English language learners, which is what this session is about. I taught bilingual classes for most of my career. I also taught Spanish to English speakers and English to English language learners in middle school and high school as well, and now teach it in at the college level. So I will pass it off to Maria. She's going to get us started, and then I'll be back with you in just a minute.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Block. I am an instructional designer here with Alana at Lone Star College, and I also am an adjunct professor of Spanish. I have my master's degree in Spanish, and I have a lot of experience studying second language acquisition. I do have an endorsement in English as a second language, and I have experience teaching English language learners. I lived in Mexico and taught English to Spanish speakers in Mexico, and also just have a lot of experience working with English language learners in general through different experiences that I've had volunteering in immigration detention centers, doing a internship with social services, and then just being a friend and an interpreter for people that I know. So we're excited to present some strategies today for supporting English language learners in your college courses. And so our objective today is really just to provide you with some tools to add to your toolbox so that you feel more comfortable and confident about supporting your English language learners that you have in your courses. So we'll give you some background information on ELLs and how the language learning process works and all of that before we go into some strategies and how to best support English language learners in your course. So who are ELLs? ELL is the abbreviation for English language learners. We like that term. There are many different abbreviations that are used in this field of talking about English language learners. We like this one because it just focuses on the fact that that these individuals are still learning English. And so English language learners can be a wide variety of different people. They might be students who finish high school and they may or may not have completed classes in basic English in their native country if they're coming from outside of the US. They could also be students who've completed high school here in the United States, but they are continuing their journey of bettering their English and want to be successful in their college level courses. And so we just really encourage you to check with your institution to see what languages and cultures are represented in your student population, because taking the time to learn about what populations you do have in your university or community college can be really helpful to just be aware of some of the maybe specific challenges that relate to those groups of students, and just being aware of cultural backgrounds and language needs and things like that. So before we go into how to support these students, we're going to talk a little bit about proficiency levels. And so I think sometimes it can be easy for us to just think that someone speaks a language or doesn't speak a language, right? Like that's what we usually ask people, like, oh, do you speak another language? And someone will be like, yeah, I speak Spanish, I speak French, etc., right? But there is actually kind of a range of your ability that you can have in a language. And so it's not necessarily that you speak or don't speak a language, you can have a certain proficiency level. And so we really like this, this graphic that we have here on the left-hand side of your screen. That is provided by ACTFL, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Language. They're an organization, and they've put this together, this framework of proficiency levels in a language to kind of help understand where a student might fall in their language proficiency. And so when we go to the next slide here, we'll kind of break it down a little bit further. So you can see that at the very bottom of that graphic, we have novice levels, which are beginner levels of a language. And so if you're in a novice level of learning a language, you're going to rely a lot on memorized phrases, and you're going to be able to, if you hear people speaking the language that you're trying to learn, you're going to pick up on bits and pieces, but it's going to be very difficult for you to just jump into a conversation and follow a whole conversation and be a part of it, right? So at a novice level, you're picking out bits and pieces and able to have really basic conversation of things that you've kind of memorized that are really formulaic kind of conversational things. And then when you move into an intermediate level of a language, you're more able to handle kind of more everyday interactions with the language. So being able to walk up to someone and just kind of have a basic conversation with them without struggling too much. So your grammar is not going to be perfect. You might still struggle here and there a little bit. But the thing here with an intermediate level is that abstract concepts are going to be really difficult for you to communicate. So everyday topics that are familiar, those are pretty easy for an intermediate speaker. But then when we get into the advanced speaker, it's moving even further beyond those everyday topics and being able to navigate a wide range of topics. So, I really like to explain this as like when you're an advanced speaker, you could go to a presentation about something in that language that's not something that's really familiar to you, and you would be able to mostly follow along, right? So if someone were to go attend a presentation that someone was giving on chemistry or something like a really advanced topic that is going to require specific content knowledge, like you would be able to kind of follow that presentation, even though it might not be an everyday topic that's super familiar to you. Okay, on this slide, we have the stages of second language acquisition. So besides going through this process of, being a beginner to intermediate to advanced, there are also other stages of learning a language that we can look at here on this screen. And so you can see that the pre-production phase usually takes about 0 to 6 months. So when you're first starting to learn a language, it's going to be very difficult for you to communicate and produce things in the language, like speaking. It's going to be very difficult. You're going to just have very basic skills in the language, just saying your name, how are you, very basic things like that. And then we move into early production, which can last for about 6 months to a year. And this is where, the language comes with a little more ease. You're still a little bit limited with, depending on basic phrases and vocabulary and patterns, but you can see that the vocabulary is also increasing to about 1,000 words versus 500. So you're starting to be able to do a lot more with the language. And then within 1 to 3 years, that's when the speech emergence can come. And so that's when it starts to become a lot more, it's a lot easier for a student to be able to actually have conversations and navigate situations in the language. You're still going to be making some grammatical errors and things like that, but you're starting to get a hang of being able to communicate, and you can see that vocab going up to about 3,000 words. So in the next stage, intermediate fluency, that can take about 3 to 5 years to be in that stage of intermediate. And so like we just talked about, being able to really start to navigate those everyday interactions with ease for the most part. And then getting all the way up to advanced can take at least up to 5 to 7 years for you to get all the way up into that advanced category where you can, navigate more unknown topics in the language, things that are not as everyday and comfortable and common to you. And so really what we're trying to show you here is that the process of learning a language takes time. It's not something that, you can just do in a year. It is a whole stage and has its stages and a whole process, and it takes time. And so to, think that a student who maybe just moved to the United States should already be fluent in the language, that's just not a realistic expectation for anyone that's trying to learn another language. It takes a lot of time and practice. And I also just want to mention that it is also common kind of in those like pre-production, early production stages there for students to go through a silent period too. So you might think that your students are not understanding something, but it's really just, you're really not ready to start producing the language. And so it's not that your students don't want to be interacting with you and things like that, but you're understanding a lot more than you are able to produce at that stage. And so it's common to kind of be silent, right? And not be producing a lot in the language.
And I just wanted to say too that there's a lot of there's a difference between productive skills and receptive skills, right? In language learning. So the receptive skills always come first, being able to listen and start to understand, and then being able to, read. Those skills are always going to come first. Being able to write and speak, those expressive skills are always going to come later. And I think sometimes it's good to see a graphic like this because you're thinking that they're able to be in the speech emergence. So they're speaking to you. So you're thinking that they're understanding everything that is coming to them, and they're understanding all of that language. This all comes from the second language acquisition theory. So this is something, maybe if you have a lot of second language learners, that it would be good for you to kind of understand a little bit. Stephen Krashen has done some amazing work, and a lot of other people have done other studies based on his work as well. And so we left this link where all of this information came from, with a lot more detail on the website than what we have here.
Okay, so now I'm going to go over a few common myths that are commonly, shared about ELLs, because if we don't understand English language learners and the process that they go through, especially, I think it's a lot easier to relate to English language learners if you've learned a second language yourself, because you know what that struggle is like of, struggling to communicate and trying to learn different parts of the language, and, having skills that are stronger than others, such as maybe it's really, if you've like taken high school Spanish, for example, right? Like maybe vocabulary was really easy for you to learn, but when it comes to speaking, it's just really difficult. And so most of us have at least a little bit of language learning experience to help us relate to that experience of English language learners. But it's also very easy to forget what that stage is like, because me, myself, having learned Spanish as my second language, it's easy for me to forget now that I've gotten to an advanced stage in the language. I can sometimes forget what my students at the Spanish 1411 level are going through. And so that's where I also really just want to recommend, like, if you ever find yourself struggling to relate to an English language learner, like download Duolingo or a language learning app and pick a random language and try to do a lesson. And it is going to be very humbling very quickly. And you're going to realize, oh my gosh, I forget how difficult this truly is. So it is really common for people to believe that English language learners are unintelligent or uneducated, especially, if they're if they're going through that silent period, right? And they're not speaking and they kind of don't really seem like they're totally all there with you. That can come across as the student being unintelligent. But think about it. If I were just to throw all of us in, if I could just speak another language besides Spanish that no one in here knew in this presentation today, and I just switched to a different language that none of us knew, we would all feel pretty unintelligent, right? It would be really hard for us to understand what's going on in the presentation. So all of this content knowledge that we all have here in our brains today, we are, experts at many different things. We have lots of professors in here. You would feel really unintelligent if all of a sudden you were thrown into completely different waters, right? You wouldn't be able to express that deep knowledge that you have because you just don't have the words to express it. So it's very easy to assume that an English language learner doesn't have intelligence or isn't highly educated, but a lot of times that's definitely not the case. And a lot of immigrants that do come here that are English language learners, they have very advanced degrees in their country, and a lot of them are having to start completely over from scratch to get a degree here that's accepted in the United States. So when I did an internship in social services, there was a woman I worked with, and she was a lawyer in Africa. She was very highly respected, but because she came over here to the United States, that degree wasn't recognized. And so she was having to work as a housekeeper and take classes to try to, get a job that would be able to support her and her daughter. And so then that runs into the next one. English language learners do not value education and or do not want to participate. Again, if your students are struggling with the language, they're still learning the language, or they have a little bit of an accent when they speak, or they're not totally sure about how to put this sentence together to answer your question, and they don't want to be embarrassed in front of their peers who speak perfect English, it might come off as though that student doesn't want to participate, but that's many times not the case. And so again, a lot of these students, they do highly value education. Just because they might not be actively participating like some of their peers in the class, there's usually reasons as to why that is, and it can easily come off as them not being interested and not wanting to be there. But I encourage you to reach out to those students and really work to build a relationship with them, because many times that's not the case. And if you are coming from another country, there's a lot that you are having to deal with at the same time. You're having to not only learn a language, but you're having to navigate culture and all of those kind of things. And if they're coming here with a whole family, that can be a really, that can be a lot for a student to be carrying. So a lot of times they just have a lot on their plates. Um, However, we can assume that all English language learners are immigrants, and that's also not the case. We have many different languages here in the United States, and so many of our students grow up speaking a native language that their family speaks in their home, and so that is their first language, is the language that they were speaking in their home. And now that once they start going to school and things like that, then they are getting exposed to English. And so not all English language learners are immigrants. Sometimes they grew up in a home, like for example, we have many students in the Houston area that grew up speaking Spanish with their parents because it's important to their family to speak the language of their ancestors and of their relatives so that they can communicate with family members. And at the same time, they're learning English when they're going to school and going out into society and stores and things like that. And so um, we can also assume, kind of tying that in, is that all ELLs are fully fluent in their native language. That's not always the case, because if you're growing up in kind of a bilingual or even trilingual, however many languages you have in your home that are being spoken, sometimes what can happen is you can have kind of a partial acquisition of a language. So when I taught high school Spanish, I had a lot of students who grew up speaking Spanish at home. That was their first language as a child. But then when those students started going to public school and speaking English, they started to lose some of their Spanish and they started to prefer English. And so their Spanish wasn't as strong as their English at that point when they got to me in middle school to take high school Spanish. And so we were going over very beginner things to try and reinforce some of the basic concepts in their language, because they had never taken a formal Spanish class. So they knew a lot of Spanish, but they didn't know all of the inner workings of the grammar and things like that. So sometimes English language learners don't have complete fluency in their native language. And so that can also pose certain struggles, because sometimes we'll assume as professors, oh, I'll just put this in a translator, this information. If you have notes or something, let's put it in a translator and give them a copy in their native language. They might not have that vocabulary in their native language to be able to actually understand those notes that we're translating into another language for those students. So just be mindful of that. Everybody has a range of abilities in any language that they speak. Even us as English speakers, we all have different abilities and strengths just as native English speakers. And so when we're putting other languages in with that as well, there's a lot that can be going on there. The other myth is that in order to effectively teach an ELL, you must know their language. Alana and I have taught many students that we do not share a language with, and so it can definitely be done. Easier said than done, but when done correctly, if you study second language acquisition, it's all about exposing your students to comprehensible input, pieces of input that they can understand bit by bit, and slowly building on that. It can definitely be done without you having to translate things into another language for your students to understand. There's so much that can be communicated with pictures and actions and things like that to support an English language learner who's at a very beginner level. And last, we have English language learners who use their native language are delaying their English learning process. So it is really important for English language learners to continue to have their native language. It's a huge part of who they are. It's a huge part of their culture, and it really doesn't delay your English language learning process. It is actually really great to be bilingual or know more than 3 languages. There's so many studies that people who know more than 1 language have a very high intelligence, and so them choosing to speak a native language with a friend in class to process something can actually do wonders for their English language acquisition and help them understand and process the content even further.
Right. All right.
And before we move on, I noticed there was a question here that I think we should address before we move on.
Okay.
It says, when talking about language acquisition, is this without taking specific classes? Because we offer ESOL intensive classes, and in that case, students can and should advance much more rapidly. Or if you just talk
Oh,
about take 2 hours a week, you may go much slower than if you're taking 16 hours a week, right? Yes, so that's correct. So if you are living and breathing the language nonstop, then you're going to acquire the language at a faster rate. But even still, it can take many years for you to still, when you're living and breathing the language, it can still take many years for you to get to that advanced stage. But yes, if you're only taking, those of you who have taken a foreign language in high school, you probably don't fluently speak that language now because you only had very little exposure to that language.
and
So
I
great
will say
question.
that I teach ESOL at night here, and I will say that even in those classes, it is not a rapid progression. So I'm teaching level 2 right now, and there are several of my students who are not going to be ready to go to level 3, even though they have worked with me, but they're only coming 2 days a week for, 2 hours at a time. And so it's really not, for some of them who need a little bit more support, maybe they're not getting English at home because they're speaking their languages at home with their families. A lot of the content that the English that they get, the exposure is slower. So sometimes it does take students several years to get through the 4 levels that we offer here at Lone Star College, and perhaps at your institution as well. You have the same kind of ESOL courses. So no, it's not always, even in college and even in what we consider to be an intensive language program, is not that fast. Also, I want you to think about the time between courses. So for example, I have students right now who have been working with me 2 times a week. And of course, I give them things to do in between, and I give them a lot of these language support kinds of things that we're going to share with you in just a moment. But, it's still, we're going to finish classes on May 7th, I believe. And then there is not another ESOL class at night because they're all working adults for them to take until August. So they're going to have, all of June and July and part of August, effectively 3 months with no more language support, right? No teaching during that time. And there is going to be a little bit of regression because they're not going to be able to continue at the same level that we have in class. So you kind of have to think about that too. It does take a while for them to progress through the courses. It's not just like you finish one semester and then always they're ready to go to the next semester. All right, so what can you do in your courses? We've given you a lot of information. I know that was a lot. Don't worry, we're going to provide this presentation to you to look at later. We'll be uploading it to the Whova app. But so you can definitely look over some of those things, and I encourage you to learn more about the language acquisition theory if you are working in a college with second language learners. But what are some things that you can do in your courses to help? So content specific language support. I can't specify enough how when you were looking at the range of proficiency levels, we're not talking until advanced levels, and some of the higher advanced levels that they're really at a point where they can get that content specific language where they can really understand that. And so giving them some support by pre-teaching the vocabulary is really important. Providing visuals, images, diagrams, any of those things, using the total physical response. We call it TPR in language teaching. And that's where you are, really kind of trying to show more expression and things whenever you're talking about a certain subject. And of course, it depends on your content area. And a shameless plug, we are here as instructional designers to support you, and we would love to help you, Maria and I both, to help you figure out what is great for your specific content. Allowing dictionary access when it's appropriate. Again, I know some people are really worried about them translating everything, and I promise you that in the ESOL classes, we do teach them all those different ways, all of the using context clues and things to not have to rely on dictionaries or translators. But sometimes it is necessary for them, if they're at some of those pre-production levels, to be at those levels of language acquisition, for them to be able to kind of process the information. So you're thinking about, you're giving them content information and they're trying to take it and, attach it to something that they already know so that they can understand it. So you have to really think, are you trying to assess their language ability, or are you trying to assess their content knowledge? So allowing them dictionary access is really going to sometimes enhance and kind of speed up their content specific language. Providing visuals, like I said, providing real life examples, taking the time to walk through some everyday examples of how they could use that in their everyday lives, or how it relates to their everyday lives, can kind of help them also understand a little bit more. Providing wait time and processing time is really important, especially for intermediate and lower advanced students. Even though they're advanced, they sometimes still are, they're going through a whole process, right? They're taking what you're giving them. They're kind of translating it sometimes still in their head, and then they're having to retranslate it back to an acceptable form to give to you. So if you think about that processing time, and really that's, you know, a good practice for a lot of students who maybe need extra support. So all of these things that we are saying our language support are also great things to do for other students with maybe learning disabilities or other things in your class as well. Focus grading on content and not language. I know this is hard for especially some disciplines, but if you could just make sure that, you know, you're not taking off English language learners, you're not focusing on was their grammar correct and was spelling correct on every single thing. You're really focusing on the content. Are they understanding your objectives? If you're going back to your objectives and you're thinking, and I understand that if yours is a writing class or yours is you know, a reading class, this may be a little bit different, but a lot of other courses, if you could focus on that and not penalize them for the grammar and the spelling mistakes, as long as they are understanding the content. Using a predictable learning framework. So in language acquisition, reducing their affective filter really does help them to learn language better and faster. So if you can have, like, they know what's going to happen in class. So a learning framework for my class, for example, they always come in, they know that there's going to be an idiom on the board. We're going to talk about the idiomatic expression. Again, this is my ESOL class. They're going to look at that. Then we're going to talk about what we did last time. We're going to kind of review it. Then we know, like, they know the progression. And I always hand them agendas when they walk into the class. Or, and I understand some of you were talking about online learning as well, you can provide that. I do provide it in D2L. So before we get started, there's always going to be, you know, the first slide, the second slide is going to be their the agenda. They know what's coming next. So they're not worried about, oh, what's coming next in class, or what do I have to do next, right? This is also good for asynchronous courses. If you can make each module in your asynchronous courses predictable for students, like they know that they're going to have to look for this first, they know where to find all of the things in your course, they know where to find the terms that are important, they know where to find how this connects. Those kinds of things are also going to make it easier for them to navigate your asynchronous course when there isn't live help as well. And allowing students to process in their native language, which I know Maria kind of talked about before. So obviously there are some things here that I talked about that would be more for high flex courses or for synchronous courses, but also think about these things when you are making perhaps videos for your asynchronous course, or when you are creating any of those materials or projects for your asynchronous courses or synchronous as well. When you're thinking about the rubrics, perhaps having a rubric that would support these kinds of learners would be helpful for them as well.
We have a few questions popping up here, and this is actually great timing because here we're on the discussion part. And so I just want to bring these up. So we've got some good things here. Seema said, providing sentence stems also helps a lot. Yes, sentence stems are basically just helping them get started with a sentence to answer a question. That can be really helpful to provide them kind of the getting started part, and then they just have to do the finishing, right? So that's a great tip. We also have a question that says, so are you saying we should not correct grammar if it is the expectation because it's a bachelor's course and it is in the rubric that the students submit scholarly rewriting? So Julie, to answer that question, no, we're talking about, like, for example, if we have a discussion post that students do weekly where they're just supposed to process the reading and the content. And it's a kind of informal assignment. Do I need to be taking off points for incorrect grammar when I'm really trying to see if my students understood the reading from this week? When we're doing scholarly writing, then absolutely the expectation is to have grammar that is correct, especially at a bachelor's level course. That should be expected of a student.
I would
And
also refer
mhm,
them to your, when
writing
you're
center.
talking about that, the writing centers are really well equipped to work with second language learners. I know that I've been in a couple of them here at Lone Star College, and the writing centers are really great about going through some things with students, and they also, you know, can take some virtual appointments as well at certain colleges. So there are other avenues for them to get help with that scholarly writing.
Yes, so absolutely. So yes, we do want our students to learn academic language and have correct grammar. It's just about thinking about when is it appropriate for me to be correcting them and when is that not what's important in this moment. So if the student is finally sharing out to the class and they say something a little bit incorrectly, is that the time to correct them? No, we want them to participate in process content. But yes, absolutely, for certain assignments, that's going to be an expectation. There's also a question here that says, in D2L, we work hard to make sure that our documents are accessible to Ally. Do you, as an ELL faculty, show students how to use Ally? In my classes, students could translate readings into their native language if they are aware of the program. I try to show them, but if you also try to reach them, that would be very helpful. I'll let Alana speak on that too, but I think most English language learners know how to translate stuff. They have tools that they know how to access to get help with that part. So I wouldn't worry too much about you needing to, I mean, it is great if we do have a tool, absolutely show your students how to use a tool properly. That's great. But I think a lot of them have already figured out how to translate things. And so that's not usually too much of a concern. And then we have a few
So,
questions
well, we
about,
can do some at
oh
the
yeah,
end too, but because we have a
yes.
couple more things
I'll let
and
you
we're
speak on
kind
that
of,
one too.
we're running a little bit short on time. But if you're just thinking about your own course, now that we've talked about some of these, what specific challenges could the ELLs encounter with your course content? So just thinking about your specific course. So if you could just drop in the chat, just what do you think? And we'll get to some other questions at the end if you want to put them in the Q&A part. I promise we'll leave some time for that. But this part is just thinking about your course and your content. Now having learned what we've talked about, what specific challenges could ELLs encounter with your course content? What do you think? Does anyone have some? No one? All right. Well, we can talk about it a little bit at the end too. Oh, okay.
My course content is unfamiliar on every level. If they do not grow up learning US history, then that's the struggle too. So yeah, also
Well,
all students have to learn academic language as well.
right.
Even if I just am an English speaker, if I'm taking a history course, I need to learn academic vocabulary. So hopefully that's
Right.
something you're taking time to highlight with all of your students, not just the English language learners. Because if I go take a chemistry course, I don't have a master's in chemistry. I'm going to struggle with those terms as well as an English speaker and need to learn what those words mean, for
And
example.
this is where pre-teaching vocabulary just is a really good pedagogical practice. So just having the vocabulary pre-taught, do we understand the vocabulary and what we're about to read before we start reading it can help. And I see someone said vocabulary and reading comprehension is a struggle. And yeah, absolutely it is, which is why if you're pre-teaching the vocabulary and then you're giving them something to think about, I always try to get my students to think about how they could connect the topic we're about to talk about, right? So this is where you could use a discussion post to kind of pre-discuss whatever we're talking about. So I know accounting is a little bit different and has other nuances, as do a lot of things, but having that moment to kind of think about how what we already know about the topic gives them kind of a way to process in their brain, like, oh yeah, I already know a little bit about this topic. And then someone said we use a Moodle and create a dictionary within the course. to have access, that's awesome to have access before the course starts. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
these things are really helpful for them. All right, we have a couple more things. So what are some active learning strategies that you can use? So some of these are going to be asynchronous and some of them are going to be synchronous, right? We have different kinds of online courses and high flex courses, of course. So sync, pair, share. Obviously, you give them some think time. We talked about that processing time. So when you're asking a question or you're posing a question, give them just a second to process it. Then pair with someone else. So they turn and talk to a partner for just a second. So they're getting that external processing, what they just thought about, and then being able to share what they thought about. And I know that this is just a good teaching practice and probably a lot of people already do it. But if you haven't, this is a great one for synchronous courses or for high flex courses. Of course, we have discussions, which I just talked about using even before the lesson. Giving them that opportunity to read other people's thoughts as well. Case studies are really great to show case because, of course, you're giving that connection to what they already know. Using simulations in online courses. I know there's not as much opportunity for hands-on learning, so being able to use those simulations where they can kind of see it happening is really great, or using scenarios as well. And, I know that I'm going to be working with one of the professors on working on some scenarios later, which are a great way also to insert into your class. Having some class debates where they get to hear the thoughts of other people and kind of process that as well. Role playing, of course, and that would obviously be in a synchronous or a high flex course, but you could also use some video responses. Sometimes maybe their writing is not as high as their ability to talk through it and for you to understand. So maybe giving them an opportunity to do some video responses in those discussion posts, and then problem solving strategies as well, giving them the ability to kind of work through what should they do first, second, third, those kinds of problem solving strategies are great as well. So this brings us to another discussion. What kinds of active learning strategies could you implement into your course to better support ELLs? And we're not saying that you don't already do these things, but what do you maybe do that could actually be supporting ELLs, although it supports other populations in your course as well, which is, I think, what Maria was talking about earlier.
Yeah, I'm seeing some comments about participation being a concern. And so I think some of those active learning strategies that Alana just went over are great, like the think, pair, share, being able to process with a smaller group before having to share out can really help because they get a chance to kind of process before being called on, like a cold call, right, in front of the whole class. But I also just
and that's
encourage you to
nerve-wracking for everybody, being cold called
exactly.
on. But
Yeah.
especially if you're already nervous about your language or your accent or what other people are going to say if you mess up the language. Now you're not even talking about the content. You're worried about how you're going to say it so that it's that affective filter is just really high, then you're not going to be able to take in the content at that point.
And I think with any student, trying to force a student to participate is the number one way to get them to not want to participate. So it can be challenging, but it's all about building relationships with your students, making them comfortable, making sure, that we normalize making mistakes, make them feel comfortable, and then just remember those stages that we talked about. They might not participate in the way that you would ideally like them to because they're just not ready for that. If they're going through a silent period, participation is not going to look the way that you might want it to look like in your course. And so try to work with that student and think of what are other ways that I can check in with this student, and look at their assignments and things that they're turning in and maybe meet with them on the side, because calling them out, that's never going to make anyone feel good.
We
Right.
have
And so
5 minutes remaining for this
yeah,
session.
so the last thing we want to talk about, then we'll get to your questions in the Q&A that we have not already answered, so please put them there. But is just learning exactly what we just said, building relationships with your students. So learning about their culture. For example, I have several students who don't in my course who don't look at me whenever I'm speaking to them. And that is because that's a sign of respect. But sometimes we are like, hey, look at me when I'm speaking to you, especially if we're on a camera, right? They're like, you should be looking at me. So understanding the culture of your students, understanding what their expectations were. I'm not saying that you should be all knowing of everything. I'm just saying these kinds of things will help you to like maybe reach them a little bit more, understand, thinking about what challenges they might be having, relating with the content of your course, giving them an opportunity to share about their culture and their traditions sometimes will make them feel more part of it. For example, last night we had a reading that we were doing, which was talking about punishments in like schools and how that's changed. It was an article. And so I asked, like, what would have been we were talking about the word penalty versus punishment, like what would have been the consequence, we were talking about all these different words for I don't know, fighting in your school. And the answers that I got were so varied. And they were like, wow, really? Oh, that was very different. And so I have a student from Bangladesh and one from Vietnam, and I have one from the Dominican Republic, and I have one from Turkey, and I have another student from Peru, and then I have one student from Korea. So all very different responses and answers that I got. And it really, you could see them kind of light up when they had just that 5 minutes of class or a discussion post in your asynchronous course, just to kind of like have something that relates to the topic, but that they're able to share their culture. And then be aware of the cultural expectations surrounding education and highlighting diverse perspectives and experiences related to your content. Perhaps inviting some guest speakers from the community, some like corporate people who have, people in the industry of whatever it is that you're teaching who maybe come from that culture could also relate, and incorporating that kind of thing in your class. All right, I know we went through a lot of information and we just have a couple of minutes left, like 3. So are there any questions? And please feel free to use the Whova app to ask any other questions as well.
So I did put in the chat because there was a question on the Whova app about simplifying instructions and removing common knowledge references. So I think the focus of our presentation here is how to support students so that they can do those things. We don't want to be removing content. We don't want to be removing cultural references. We want to help them navigate those things in our course. So we don't want to water down anything for our students just because they're learning language. We're wanting to support them so that they can learn language and can perform at the level of their peers that are in the course. And so I think a lot of students are already familiar with tools to help them understand things such as translation tools and ChatGPT and things like that. So I think our focus here has been really how to support them in being able to do those things.
And I know we only have about a minute, so I just want to make sure that I say again, please come to Maria or I. We would absolutely love to work with you. If you would like for us to navigate with you, maybe a part of your course, like you want to look at it together, and we can absolutely look at that and see maybe how could we help some of if you have a course that has a lot of ELLs historically in it, then we would love to be able to work with you on that and maybe give some ideas of different things that could help. So you do have some resources for you as well.
Yeah, and we're on LinkedIn, we're on the Whova app. So those of you from outside of Lone Star, feel free to reach out. Like, we're here to provide support and lead you in the right direction no matter where you are. So please absolutely reach out.
Yes, absolutely. And we just want to say you can learn more, right, by continuing education, by looking at the research, and from your students most of all. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.